Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is the Top 5 Mistakes Made in Microsoft Enterprise Renewals webinar presented by Miro Consulting. Here at Miro Consulting, we specialize in software license audit defense, license management, subscription management, and cloud services for Microsoft, Oracle, and IBM. My name is Sean Donahue, and I'm the VP here at Miro Consulting. Joining me today is Tim Hegedus, Senior Analyst at Miro. If you have any questions during the broadcast, please use the question box in your webinar control panel, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Important note, all questions will be kept strictly confidential and are only visible to us, the presenters. If you are a Microsoft customer, it's very important to understand that Microsoft resellers are required by contract to report any shortfalls in your licensing. Miro Consulting is not a Microsoft reseller. So this is an opportunity to ask questions about Microsoft licensing without having to worry about Microsoft finding out. So let's get started with the presentation on the top 5 mistakes made in Microsoft Enterprise Renewals. Tim, please start us off.
Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome to everyone out there today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And we welcome and thank you for taking some time out of your day, your first day of summer, to join us here today. What we're going to do today is talk about the enterprise agreement, Microsoft's enterprise agreement. And that's a great big ho-hum type thing, right? Well, perhaps not so fast, right? In Miro's experience, we have seen many organizations who go it alone only to find themselves ill-positioned, over-licensed, or perhaps spent unwisely. So we're going to take you through some of this, and we'll start with just a brief overview, right? Now, your organization might have standardized on the Microsoft platform, and if that's fine, then it would certainly seem to make things easier for you. But many organizations rely on multiple vendors and create something of a best-of-breed approach to implement their technology and their controls. And this investment is very large, often near the very top of the list in terms of overall money spent. But a 3-year commitment is, well, forever in today's business climate. You may recall a time when companies developed 5-year plans, and then that was later reduced to 3-year plans. Well, many organizations today are down to an 18-month plan, and still others have adopted something of a read and react mentality as they innovatively use technology which enables them to outrun their competition, because no organization can afford to get caught flat-footed any longer. So we want to take you through these areas where Microsoft sees organizations overlooking or making faulty assumptions, perhaps, and hopefully this discussion will facilitate your own efforts. The very first mistake is, frankly, waiting too long. And as you very likely are aware, Microsoft's fiscal year end is really just a few days away on June 30th. And their fiscal fourth quarter is a particularly busy time for them as they try to close deals, especially enterprise agreements. But this has been going on for years. It's very common to have the anniversary dates and the renewals for these enterprise agreements occur during this fourth quarter. But if you're tuning in today, then that probably isn't the case. In other words, you have your enterprise agreement renewal still in front of you. And perhaps it's in Microsoft's fiscal first quarter, which ends on September 30th. And that possibly corresponds to your own fiscal year end. Or perhaps your enterprise agreement renews at the end of the calendar year, which happens to be the end of Microsoft's fiscal second quarter. It's also a very, very busy time of year, and it may also be the end of your own fiscal year. So we're right in your wheelhouse, and now is the time to start planning for that renewal. You're going to want to collect data on future plans, right? On growth, on contraction, transitioning to the cloud, new or enhanced applications perhaps, upgrades, consolidations, and much, 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 much more. In essence, here's what you're doing. You're asking the stakeholders what their plans, expectations, and hopes are for the 36-month period that begins months from now, right? That's not an easy question to answer. And you must be very, very kind, so kind as to give them enough time to sort all that out and come up with meaningful answers upon which you can act. And then you have to assemble all the budgeting for the Microsoft environment that supports those plans. And at the same time, these stakeholders might also be thinking about truing up. You should too, but don't, right? This is the second mistake, right? Combining the true up with the renewal. And the reason is that the renewal is forward-looking. That is, that it deals with your organization's investment over the next 3 years. What gets included in it is TBD, or to be decided, and its terms and conditions are still negotiable, and your options are still open. But none of that is true for the existing agreement, of which the true-up is part, right? The price points have been defined, for example, as has the content of the agreement. And since it was inked nearly 3 years ago, renegotiating any of those terms and conditions is virtually impossible. So the true-up and the renewal are two distinct processes, both of which deserve your undivided attention and very, very careful deliberation. And they're separated by the renewal date. So that said, Microsoft is going to try to combine them. This can easily cause a lot of confusion, which I suppose benefits Microsoft. In one current instance, Microsoft issued its renewal proposal, which incorporated the true-up. And this was totally egregious. This is something that we worked on here at Miro. Because the client was planning a transition to the cloud, right, for multiple divisions, I should add, Microsoft wanted the easy way out and issue a from SA SKU for Office 365. Okay? Not bad on the surface, except that the problem was that some of the divisions didn't have Office under software assurance in their current agreement. So Microsoft blithely added a true-up for the number of Office licenses to their proposal, just so that the from SA SKU, which is essentially a step-up SKU, could be used throughout the organization. Not only was that very lazy on Microsoft's part, but it was an additional cost to the client of over $2 million, millions of dollars caused by Microsoft's laziness. Now, it's important to realize that the true-up process does feed the renewal in a certain sense. That is, while there's an obligation to true-up based on the existing agreement, that very same product may not be included in the next agreement. So the thinking must incorporate that into the process, right? So similarly, there might be a case for adding licenses that were formerly excluded from the enterprise agreement. And yes, there is a way to do that. And yes, this must be part of the renewal process. Plus, there's a new set of enterprise agreement documents, the enrollment forms, the signature forms, perhaps even a brand new Microsoft Business and Services Agreement, or an MBSA. It's all part of this renewal process. And there's language in these forms that you really need to be carefully considering, or they might just come back to haunt you. Mistake number 3 is being unaware of the licensing changes. Now, if you're like most organizations, Microsoft licensing is not the focal point of your business life. That may be because there really isn't a formal software asset management program in place, or it may be because license management really isn't anyone's job, or it simply may be because the enterprise agreement only renews every 3 years, so why bother with it except at that time? Right? Well, first, trying to understand, or perhaps more correctly, re-understand Microsoft licenses just for the purpose of renewing your enterprise agreement is sort of like drinking from a fire hose. There's simply too much to know, too much to understand, too many decisions to make. And guess what? Neither your Microsoft account team nor your reseller are going to be very helpful, right? And because they don't have your best interests at heart. They are, in fact, incented by your spend. So let's look at some of this at the slide for some examples, right? In its latest iteration of the Microsoft agreement, called a refresh, by the way, Microsoft upped the minimum number of qualifying devices or users to 500 from 250. This actually occurred at the start of Microsoft's current fiscal year, or last July. Now, you might not be directly affected by it, but if you are, the questions are, were you aware of this change? Or are you aware that there is a one-time out for this change? Now, in October of last year, Microsoft released Windows Server 2016, as well as System Center 2016. And were you aware that the metric changed from per processor to per core for those products? Were you aware that there is a grant program associated with this change of metric? And do you know the mechanics of that grant program? Right? So these are all very, very important questions. And then there is the other reasons that software assurance is required. Yes, it's absolutely required in these cases. The first is with Nano Server, part of the Windows Server 2016 feature set. And another is the long-term servicing channel, or some of you might know it as the long-term servicing branch, or LTSB, for Windows 10, right? That came about in July of 2015, right? And by the way, for those of you who might have missed it, Miro just held a webinar on that topic of long-term service branch and the other service models back in April. So if you haven't, we encourage you to request a copy of that presentation at Miro's website. And then, of course, there's the older reasons. I'm using air quotes here, the older reasons for needing software assurance. One is license mobility, of course, cold disaster recovery licensing, and the somewhat arcane self-hosted application rules. So we have to be aware of all that. Now, we wish, honestly, that we had time to go into each of these in a little bit more detail, but frankly, there isn't time. However, you're invited to drop us a line, and we can connect post-webinar today. So call it what you want, over-licensing or shelfware or whatever, but purchasing too much software or software assurance is overspending. And this is where you can make a real impact during the renewal process. Overspending is bad business, but there isn't a company in the world that expects to use software for nothing. But let's face it, fair is fair. Software licensing and support are legitimate business expenses, but if you don't need the software, and I mean really need the software, then purchasing it is wasteful. So in addition to all those questions that you asked before about growth, contraction, upgrades, consolidation, and so on, you want to view with a very critical eye what Microsoft is putting on the table. Today, and I would suppose for the foreseeable future, The pressure for Microsoft is on hosted services like Office 365 and Exchange and SharePoint Online and the myriad of Azure offerings. Now, we can't and won't go into the dynamics of hosted services at this point, but suffice it to say that Microsoft will push very, very, very hard to sell you some Microsoft Online offerings. And in some cases, in fact, they will make the concessions you received reliant on them. For example, many a very sly account manager has kind of snuck in this thing called Azure Monetary Commitment into an enterprise agreement, only to tell the very astute questioning customer that it is required in order to get the discount that he or she wants. That is indeed very, very sly, right? But the question is whether you need these services or perhaps whether you need them now. Like it or not, once you've inked that deal, the payments have to be made on it. So if some competing priority throws you off course for, say, your transition to Office 365, then you're paying for it and not really using it. Then there are these packages that Microsoft is pushing. Right? One is the Secure Productive Environment, or the SPE, which combines Office 365 and Windows 10 and Microsoft's Enterprise Mobility and Security offering. Right? That's called EMS. It used to be called Enterprise Mobility Suite. Now this last one, this EMS, includes Microsoft's security offering, which is almost always duplicate functionality. In my personal case, it has always been duplicate functionality because most, if not all, organizations have something like McAfee or Norton or Symantec or some other anti-malware solution already running, already being supported. And in addition to the initial investment in those products, there is the annual support that's needed to maintain currency on the product itself as well as the signatures. So the resources that are tasked with the maintenance of these products would now have to use another product or be trained on using another product. And that transition, regardless of the level of planning that went into it, won't occur overnight. So your organization is going to end up paying for both solutions simultaneously. Right now, the next one listed is the Server and Cloud Enrollment, or the SCE. It's a separate enrollment from the Enterprise Agreement, but Microsoft will sometimes add it to the mix just to foster a little bit more confusion. Again, a very critical eye is called for here, and we really don't have time again today to go into the particulars, but generally the SCE is not as advantageous as it's purported to be by Microsoft. Now, finally, we talk about bundling, okay? And it's a very broad topic, and we cite just two examples here. The first is what Microsoft refers to as a platinum agreement. This occurs when all the product pools are included in the enterprise agreement. So this is Office or Office 365, Windows client, Windows 10, right? And the client access license suite, or a CAL suite, like the Enterprise CAL suite or the Core CAL suite. Collectively, these are referred to as the enterprise products. And under a platform enterprise agreement, these products enjoy an additional 15% discount. But that's not to say that it's appropriate. The licensing of these products under an enterprise agreement makes software assurance inherent, right? And it might just be that the benefits that Microsoft offers as software assurance coverage for all these products, all of which differs, by the way, won't be utilized. So it could really be money from nothing, right? What I mean is $4 plus $4 for two of the products is still cheaper than $3 for each of the products, right? So, okay, that's not the greatest example, but that 15% discount really doesn't overwhelm the cost of just not having software assurance on some of these products. So still another example is this core infrastructure suite. This combines or groups together Windows Server and System Center. And if you've standardized on the System Center as a platform, as a management and monitoring platform for your Windows environment, then that is ultimately the way to go. But it's worth asking whether every deployment will be managed by System Center and whether every deployment therefore needs to be licensed with this core infrastructure suite. Finally, and probably most profoundly, is the mistake of under-budgeting. The last of these 5 oversights may or may not be your direct responsibility, but it will impact you, and we'll go into how that occurs in just a moment. But first, let's be aware that Microsoft does not increase its prices uniformly. That is by a set amount or across the board, meaning for each product. Rather, Microsoft increases its prices when new features or new functionality is deemed more valuable. And so the prices are erratically, for the lack of a better word, applied. But Microsoft also makes some changes or price adjustments based on metrics, right? Changes in metrics like what occurred for Windows Server 2016. Now, when a new or renewed enterprise agreement is written, it uses the prevailing price points. No one, not even the account team, can predict when the actual date for a particular product will be for release, whether it will include new features or functionality, or especially what it will cost. So everything in your current enterprise agreement or your renewed enterprise agreement will have the prevailing price. For your new agreements, it's going to be the price of that product costs today. That includes new products, software assurance, and subscriptions, and true-ups, and future products. And even though the price on any one of those could change, and probably will, for you, it remains as written throughout the term of the agreement. So that, in effect, is a price hold. So any item within the customer price sheet, or the CPS, has already had its price determined, and you can bank on that. But then when you're renewing, new price points come into play. So it is not reasonable to assume that the price for SQL Server will be 25% of the prior cost, which is to say only software assurance for the existing licenses. It is equally unreasonable to assume that the price has increased, say, just 5%. It could, but Miro has seen prices on some products increase by as much as 30 to 35% over a single enterprise agreement term. So software assurance fees represent 25% of a cost that is 35% more. And in fact, the new Office 365 prices, the Plan E5, which replaced the old Plan 4, right, cost 37% more than it did back in 2015. So this is not limited to just on-premise software. And in fact, adopting a cloud strategy could become wildly expensive. But this is not the forum for that. But once again, we do invite you to contact us about it, and we absolutely promise you that that will be time well spent. Anyway, Microsoft has truly mastered the art of sticker shock. And so how do you budget for that? Well, Miro suggests that the budget for renewed enterprise agreement be increased by 50%, 50%. Is that astounding? Is that outrageous? Yes, it is. But you can hardly go back to the well, right? Once the budget is improved, call the Masons, man, and have that thing set in stone. Now, in reality, there might be some flexibility in rebudgeting, but who wants to be that guy that goes back and asks for that, right? Now, there's also the possibility of diverting funds from one or more unlucky projects to the enterprise agreement, but that is not a pleasant experience for anyone involved. And then there's something even more sinister lurking, and this is the impact to you. That is that the technical decision of, say, upgrading to a new release of Windows is upended by the financial decision to hold or reduce spend. Now, having operated on both sides of that fence, I can assure you it's not a great place to be. So 50%, that's the increase. And when you have asked all the right questions and made the most informed decisions you have, you can bring it home under budget, and you are the hero. So, our takeaways, right? These are the important points that you will want to consider either as a technical professional who is charged with supporting the Microsoft environment, or even as a senior manager who's responsible for sourcing its operations and funding its investment, right? Our first takeaway is don't put this off to the last minute, right? You can count on your Microsoft account manager to start the process early in order to close the deal on time. But Microsoft is really, really known for pressing its customers right up against their renewal date, leaving precious little time to review and debate and argue about it. So do yourself a favor, be prepared, and then when your Microsoft account manager calls, be in a position to tell them, yeah, let's talk. We're ready for you. Our second takeaway is recognizing that there is interplay between them. Keep the true-up process and the renewal process separate and distinct. Our third takeaway is really to phone a friend like Miro to help you understand the licensing changes, the current hot topics, and how these affect your decision-making, as well as to help guide your interactions with Microsoft and your reseller. And then finally, budget accordingly. Remember 50%, and start having those conversations now. And if necessary, because it's sometimes better to have a new voice involved, engage an expert like a Miro to assist you with that process. So I turn it back over to Sean at this point and see if there's any questions that have been brought.
All right, thanks, Tim. We have a couple of questions from the audience. However, we are out of time at the moment, so what we're going to do for everyone, so you can get back to your day, is we're going to answer the questions in an email that we're going to follow up with and send to everyone so you can see what questions were asked and what Miro's answers are. If you have further questions, please email us at info@miroconsulting.com or check us out online at miroconsulting.com. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much. Have a great day.